story ideas can come from the weirdest of places. But I had a story that the idea came to me from somebody getting trapped in a chimney. And no, I'm not talking about Santa Claus. Welcome to the INRIS Files, thoughts on pop culture, history, and the human condition from a very specific Generation X point of view. I talk here a lot about stories and storytelling. Not necessarily the same thing, but I try to tell stories about storytelling. Now I'm going to tell you a story about a story. I was at a writer's workshop. It was actually what they call a master class, and it was 2 weeks long, intensive. We were on premises, on site for the whole 2 weeks in the Lincoln City, Oregon. And the workshop was run by Christine Catherine Rush and Dean Wesley Smith. I think if you're going to be a successful, multiply published author, it really helps to have 3 full names. Anyway, one of the first things they told us is when you're going to write, you write. You don't worry about the market. You start with the story. You write. Then you worry about finding the market and cleaning up and all, redrafting if need be. But you write the story you want to write. And this was something that I really took to heart. Now, there were, 17 or 18 of us in this workshop. I keep thinking 17, but I don't know if that number is correct. That number might be from another workshop I was in called Clearing West. But there were about that many of us, right? Just under 20. And some of us were morning people, and some of us were night owls. And I was one of the night owls. Dean was one of the night owls as well. And so frequently, not always, but frequently, Dean had set a challenge for himself. Every night of the workshop, he was going to write a short story of his own. So as we were writing stories, he was writing stories. And he took it as a challenge. And what he did was he started with a title, and that was it. And then he would generate the story from the title. But the title had to be interesting. And I remember toward the end of the masterclass, we were mostly done with the writing exercises. We had turned in several stories. We had turned in tables of contents for a hypothetical anthology, and now there was the wind down. We still had a couple lessons to go. We weren't entirely done with our time there, but most of the assignments were done. And one evening, and so one of these evenings, Dean Wesley Smith was up with one of my fellow workshoppers. His name is Joe, and the two of them, I don't know what they were talking about, but I ended up joining the conversation, and the conversation Dean wanted a title so that he could do some writing. And I don't know how, but somehow we landed on this idea of cheerleader revelations. I have no idea whose idea that was or how that idea popped up. It was not the first one that we had discussed, but it was, man, what a fascinating title. And so all 3 of us decided that we were all 3 going to write a story using that title. And we did. And that was just kind of neat. In the meantime, though, and I may be misremembering some of these details, and Joe, if you ever see this, I'd love it if you could clarify your memory of how all of this worked out. But at some point, the 3 of us, again, Joe, myself, and Dean, were up late night toward the end. In fact, this might have been the last night of the workshop. And Joe shared with Dean and me a story that he had written that was based on something that actually happened in his life, where he was tasked with taking out the old chimney from his house, and then later on some other construction was going to happen that needed that chimney to be gone. So he started from the top, as one does, and he had his big sledgehammer, and he knocks away the bricks, and he's working his way down until he gets to the bottom, and now he's stuck because there's just this big shaft going back up to the top of the house, but he's down at the bottom of the shaft. I don't remember the details. I know he described where the bricks went, and I know he described how he eventually got out. He obviously eventually got out. He was able to participate in the workshop. But it was an exceedingly funny story about not only, the process of getting down there, but then the process of getting out once he realized what had happened. And I appreciated that story so much, and it inspired me. I want to write a story using that as a launching point. And so I did. I called it Brick by Brick, and I just started with this image in my mind of knocking down a chimney, brick by brick, one way, one brick at a time, working all the way down. That was the starting image. And I wrote it. And it ended up being a variation on the Three Little Pigs story, where you have one house that's made of straw, one house that is made of sticks, and one house that is made of bricks. And I decided that I was going to tell the story from the point of view of the big bad wolf. So, I wrote a children's story at a science fiction and fantasy writers workshop. This is not unlike me. I do this sort of thing all the time. One of the other anthologies, which was called Swordplay, again, and the call for submissions went out again to science fiction and fantasy writers, and I had written a time travel story for that anthology, submitted it. The editor loved what I had submitted, but she said she couldn't buy it because it felt more like the first chapter of a novel. She wanted me to write that novel, but before I do, I had a week to submit another story, and I did, but the story I submitted was about Custer's sword, right? Again, remember, the name of the anthology was Swordplay. Custer's sword is featured in all of the paintings that you ever see of Custer. And yet, when he went into that last battle, known as Custer's Last Stand, he ordered his men not to bring their cavalry swords. So why is he always depicted as holding a cavalry sword after he had ordered all of his men to leave their swords behind? So that story has nothing to do with science fiction or fantasy, but that was the sword I ended up choosing to write about. I submitted it, she bought it, and didn't require any changes in that, which is a writer's dream, is to be able to please an editor that much that the editor doesn't even ask for changes. So, again, not unlike me to write something that is not science fiction or fantasy while I'm at a science fiction and fantasy writers workshop. And keep in mind, we were told, don't worry about the market. You start by writing the story. I wrote the story because I wanted to, and I thought it was funny, and I just had a good time writing it. Now, what am I going to do with it? Heinlein's rules of writing, Robert A. Heinlein, famous science fiction author, he says, first, write it. Second, you got to send it out there. Actually, the second rule is finish what you start. So you start writing it, you finish writing it, you send it out there, and then you start working on the next one. Those are Heinlein's 4 rules for writing fiction. If you want to sell your fiction, this is what you have to do. Okay, I wrote it. I finished it. I was reading it whenever I would go into a situation where there would be authors reading their stories. This was one I always trotted out because it was a very short length. It's 1,500 words, which is very short for a short story. But it's a little bit longer than flash fiction tends to be. Flash fiction is usually 1,000 words or less. So this didn't quite count as flash fiction, but I could read it in a setting where authors are reading their work. It was very entertaining, got a lot of good reactions, but I couldn't find a market for it. I looked at Boy's Life, which was the magazine of the Boy Scouts of America. Well, they don't want stories about animals. The stories have to be about people. So, all right, well, that rules out a variation of the Three Little Pigs. I did submit it to the Atlantic Monthly. I submitted it to a couple of other well-known monthly magazines that were selling fiction at the time. Most of them don't anymore, if they even still exist. I wonder if the Atlantic still publishes fiction. I'm gonna have to look that up. I was shooting high, by the way, which is where you start. You start by going for the biggest markets and that it might be appropriate for. You work your way down. Obviously, right, what I wrote was a variation on a children's story, but obviously if I'm sending it to markets like the Atlantic, I really felt like there was a market that was beyond just children for this particular story. Well, as I say, I shopped it around. I even considered the idea of self-publishing it, and I was talking with an artist friend of mine to possibly draw the cover for it. She's very talented, and I thought that this would be amazing, but then that fell through for various reasons. And by the way, I feel very strongly, wherever possible, pay the artist. I was going to commission this work from her. These days with AI, you can generate book covers just by telling your AI of choice, build me a book cover. And when I release my collection later this year of short stories, and this one will be in that collection, by the way, when I do, I'm going to do everything I can to have a cover that is designed by a competent professional designer rather than having it designed by AI. And you got to pay the artist. I feel very strongly about that. Anyway, so the self-publishing idea kind of fell through for a little while just because it was very important to me to do it right, and the illustrator who I thought would be perfect for it wasn't available. And then several years later, after I was no longer circulating the story for sale, an editor named Bob Brown, who he puts together anthologies of science fiction and fantasy stories, and I later on sold another story to him. But he started putting out calls for submissions to a collection of stories for thoughtful children. It ended up turning into two anthologies, stories, and then the other one was poems for the... he ended up calling it Stories for the Thoughtful Young, published by B Cubed Press. Bob Brown and Diana Payton were the editors. And so I submitted this story for consideration because I thought not only was this a book that was aimed at parents to read to their children, but it was also going to feature other writers from the science fiction and fantasy community. So I felt like I was right at home, even though this was just a fairy tale. It wasn't. It didn't quite fit into the science fiction genre that I normally submit to. He bought the story. You probably figured that out because I held up the book. Yeah, he bought the story, and I was just so happy that I had found a market for this story. And one of the reasons I mention this is because if you are an aspiring writer and you want to sell your writing, just because you don't get yeses right away doesn't mean you won't eventually get a yes. You just need to continue to write. Don't stop writing, waiting until you sell this one. Keep writing, but you never know. The stuff that you wrote years ago might end up finding a home. Anyway, I wanted to tell you that story. I think it was just funny how one person's funny story inspired in me a completely different story that I also thought was humorous. and I'm going to read you this story now. I may eventually put together an audiobooks version of this story. For the purposes of this recording, I'm just going to read it to you, and if I make mistakes, I make mistakes. But I hope you enjoy it. It's been a little while since I've read it, so I may not get the voice as well practiced as it was on previous occasions, but we'll see. And by the way, this is very much an exercise in voice. The name of the story is Brick by Brick, and again, you can, if you want to buy it and read it to your own kids, you can find it in the anthology Stories for the Thoughtful Young, edited by Bob Brown and Diana Payton. And you'll be able to buy it from my own collection, which I'll be releasing later this year. Brick by Brick. So, I ate a brick house the other day. It was the third house in my list of 3, and the first one was made of straw, and I made short business of that one, let me tell you. The second one wasn't quite as easy as the first, but I still did okay. I just huffed and I puffed until I made my way to the chewy center and enjoyed a delicious meal. The third one, though, that was the problem. No matter how much I huffed and I puffed, it just wasn't coming down. No sirree, Bob. I asked the tasty little morsel inside to let me in, but he just went on and on about his facial hair and said not going to happen. You'd think that if you asked somebody nice and pleasant like to let you in so you could eat them, they'd be more than happy to open their door wide open and let you do what you're going to do anyway. But no, this little piggy stayed home and he wasn't letting me in. So I said, look, pal, if you don't let me in, I'm going to huff and puff, thinking that maybe this would change his mind, but it didn't, so I did, and like I said before, huffing and puffing at brick houses is about as effective as spitting on a fish. Now, the guy inside starts singing this song about how nobody's afraid of Big Bad Me, which is just getting me madder and madder. I just ate 2 of his kin in the flimsy little shacks that he's thumbing his hoof at me with a big old neener. That just ain't right. So I figure, if he ain't gonna let me in, I can just wait out here till he comes out. You see, while he's on my list to eat and all, it's not like I'm starving just yet. I mean, after all, I just had a couple of delicious meals, and I could handle a little break between courses, if you catch my drift. The guy inside, the pig by the name of Arnold, and no, I don't mean Roseanne Arnold. The pig was clever enough to build a brick house without even having opposable hooves, which must have been quite a trick if you ask me, and I'm pretty sure he knew a brick house would stand up to huffing and puffing, but he only built it with 1 door. You might say this was a bit of a mistake strategic-wise, because it meant that if I wanted to wait him out, I only had to wait just outside that 1 door. And also meant that if I wanted to lock him in, well, there was just that 1 point of egress, as my cousin Petunia used to say, that needed blocking. So I waited outside that 1 door, but he wasn't coming out. Come out, wherever you are, I said, but he just kept singing inside that brick house about how he'd been to market, and, well, next thing you know, I smell roast beef coming from inside the house. There was smoke coming from the chimney. He was cooking his roast beef on a fire in his fireplace, and that's what made me realize that I could have just jumped up on the roof and climbed down and gotten in that way. No huffing and puffing required. But now it was too late, because he was cooking himself some dinner, and going down the chimney would be mighty hot. But that gave me an idea on how I might be able to get him to come out to me instead of making me go in to get him. I kept an eye on that 1 point of egress, as my Uncle Wilbur would call it, while I went to where the shack next door used to be and picked up the sticks and piled them around the outside of the brick house. Then I pulled out my box of matches, and I got a match and tried to light one of those sticks, and boy, if you think it's hard to light a brick on fire without kindling, I'm here to tell you that thick old sticks ain't much better when all you got is them little Ohio blue tip matches. But that pig at the poke was still singing about not being afraid of Big Bad Me, and by the sounds and the smells, he was still enjoying his roast beef. So I went over to where the other shack used to be, the straw one just 2 spots over, and I got a bunch of straw and piled that up in and around the sticks. This time, I pulled out a match and lit it. Well, that straw caught fire real nice like. Oh, and if you're wondering how a wolf with no opposable paws can light a match, I'll remind you that this was those Ohio blue tip matches, the kind that you can light with your teeth. So the straw caught on fire, but just in that one area. So I huffed and puffed like they taught us in Cub Scouts, and once the sticks caught fire, I took one and I used it to light up the kindling all around the brick house. Well, I stood back and I watched that front door. But soon I noticed a great big old plume of smoke rising out of the chimney, which got me to thinking that maybe my next meal had just doused the fire in his fireplace. Sure enough, before too long, he pops up out of the chimney and he says for me to cut it out. It's getting all hot in his house. All them sticks are burning real nice by this time. And I says, no, I'm not going to stop. And in fact, I trot over next door to get some more sticks and I drop them on the fire. Well, that just makes him mad, boy, I'll tell you. And he disappears again and then pops up with a hammer and he whacks one of those bricks from the chimney loose and he throws it at me. Yes, sirree, Bob, that's what he did. And you know what I did? Well, I saw I was breaking his will. So I decided to keep pressing my advantage in this little psychological duel we were playing out. I caught that hurtling brick right between my teeth, I did, and I chomped and I chewed and I swallowed that sucker and just grinned up at him with the meanest, nastiest, ugliest grin I knew how to grin. Oh man, you should have seen the look of fear in his eyes. Well, now he starts panic-like, and he whacks at them bricks in his chimney, and he throws them down at me, and I show him I ain't gonna stop, and I just keeps chomping and chewing and eating and grinning. And as he worked his way down the house, tearing it apart brick by brick and tossing them at me, the fire around his house died down too, until there was nothing left but a concrete foundation, the front door, and the smoldering remains of my fire going around the outside. Well, all that plus his furniture, which was really quite lovely. So now, there wasn't no house for me to even huff and puff down except for the door and the foundation, and you can't very well blow down a foundation, but he's just standing inside there, looking out at me through where there used to be bricks, and I'm just staring right back at him, thinking that this time he's just got to open the front door and come out. But then I realized something. I wasn't hungry no more. It wouldn't matter if he came out or not because I just flat out lost my appetite. So I nod to the pig once like, and he nods to me once like, and I saunter on my way and leave him standing there on his smoldering foundation with the one big door sticking up and that exquisite furniture. I'll have to ask him where he got it one day. And save that particular meal for another day, I guess. But that's all by way of saying, my little cubs, that if you're hungry enough to eat a house, you don't eat it all at once. You have to eat it one brick at a time. Thanks for joining me at the INRIS Files. I hope you enjoyed that little story, and maybe I'll have another story in mind some future episode. Till then, enjoy your day. See you later.